At dinner, my sister said no one takes you seriously. Now I'm her boss. The clatter of silverware against porcelain was a familiar symphony in my childhood home, a soundtrack to hurried meals and hushed arguments. Tonight it was a discordant din, each scrape of a fork amplifying the tension that had been building between my sister Clara and me for years. We were seated across from each other at the polished oak table, the same table where we'd once shared secrets and scraped knees. Now it felt like a battlefield. The scent of roast chicken, usually a comfort, hung heavy and cloying in the air. My father, ever the peacemaker, attempted to steer the conversation towards the weather, his voice a gentle murmur against the storm brewing between us. But the storm had a name, and it was me. Clara's eyes, usually sparkling with a warmth that could melt glaciers, were hard, flinty. She'd always been the sensitive one, the one who felt things deeply, while I was built of sterner stuff, or so I told myself. I was the pragmatist, the one who got things done, the one who didn't let emotions cloud judgment. I saw her vulnerability as weakness, her artistic aspirations as frivolous distractions. She saw my ambition as ruthlessness, my drive as a void where empathy should have been. This dinner was supposed to be a truce, a rare moment of familial harmony. Instead, it was a catalyst. The air crackled, not with anticipation, but with unspoken accusations. My father cleared his throat, a nervous habit. My mother's gaze flitted between us, her lips pressed into a thin line. Clara's hand, usually so graceful as she sketched or painted, trembled as she reached for her water glass. I watched her, a detached observer, cataloguing her every nervous tick. My internal monologue already formulating a defense, a counter-argument. I was adept at this, at dissecting people, at finding their weak points and exploiting them, not out of malice, but out of a misguided belief that it was the only way to navigate a world I perceived as inherently unfair. I believed that a certain degree of hardness was necessary for survival, a shield against the inevitable disappointments life threw your way. Clara, with her open heart and boundless creativity, seemed ill-equipped for such a world, and I, in my arrogant certainty, felt it was my duty to prepare her, even if my methods were less than gentle. I'd always been the older sibling, the one who was supposed to be stronger, wiser, but wisdom, I was beginning to suspect, was a different beast entirely from intelligence or success. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Then Clara spoke, her voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the room like a shard of glass. "No one takes you seriously," she said, her gaze fixed, not on me, but on a point somewhere beyond my shoulder, as if the words were too painful to utter directly. The words hung in the air, heavy with a history of dismissals, of being overlooked, of being underestimated. It wasn't a taunt, it was a statement of fact, delivered with a weariness that suggested she'd accepted this truth long before I had. My initial reaction was a surge of indignant pride. Me, not taken seriously? I, who had climbed the corporate ladder with relentless determination, who had built a career on my ability to command respect, to make people listen. It was absurd. Yet as I looked at her, at the subtle tremor in her lower lip, the way her shoulders seemed to sag under an invisible weight, a flicker of something unfamiliar stirred within me. It wasn't guilt, not yet. It was more like a discordant note in the symphony of my self-assurance. The roast chicken suddenly tasted like ash in my mouth. The carefully constructed edifice of my own importance began to show hairline cracks. The air in the room shifted, the unspoken animosity replaced by a profound, unsettling quiet. My father stopped mid-chew, his fork hovering. My mother's eyes widened slightly. Clara's words, delivered with such quiet despair, had landed with the force of a physical blow, not because they were untrue, but because they were so profoundly, heartbreakingly true, and delivered by the one person whose validation I secretly craved, even as I outwardly dismissed her. This wasn't about a business deal or a project deadline. This was about the core of who I was, or who I thought I was. The realization that my sister, the one person who had known me longer than anyone, saw me as someone lacking fundamental credibility, someone who had failed at the most basic level of human connection, was a cold, sharp shock. It was the first crack in the armor I'd so meticulously forged, the first tremor of an earthquake that would soon reshape the landscape of my life. The tremor in Clara's voice was a physical manifestation of the chasm between us, a chasm I had widened with every dismissive word, every impatient gesture. I saw it then, not just in her trembling hand, but in the way she flinched almost imperceptibly when I shifted in my seat, as if expecting a blow. My ambition, which I'd always viewed as a noble pursuit, now seemed like a blunt instrument, wielded without care, leaving wreckage in its wake. The sting of her words, "No one takes you seriously," wasn't just about professional credibility. It was about a deeper, more fundamental failure to be seen, to be understood, even by the people who mattered most. My father's attempt at small talk died on his lips, the unspoken weight of Clara's accusation settling over the table like a shroud. My mother's usual placid expression was replaced by a subtle tightening around her eyes, a silent acknowledgement of the truth in Clara's lament. I'd always been the driven one, the one who charted a course and never deviated, convinced that success was the ultimate validation. Clara, with her messy studio, her paint-stained fingers, and her unwavering belief in the power of beauty, was everything I wasn't, everything I deemed impractical. I dismissed her dreams as childish fantasies, her sensitivity as a handicap. I'd built my life on logic and strategy, on a world of quantifiable results, and in doing so, I'd systematically dismantled any bridge that might have connected me to the emotional reality of others, most notably my own sister. The air grew thick with the unspoken, the years of subtle slights and overt dismissals coalescing into a palpable force. Clara's gaze finally met mine, and in her eyes I saw not anger but a profound, bone-deep weariness, a resignation that was far more damning than any accusation. It was the look of someone who had fought a long and losing battle, not for victory but for acknowledgement. The scent of the roast chicken, once a symbol of family gatherings, now seemed to mock me, its richness a stark contrast to the hollowness I suddenly felt. I wanted to retort, to unleash a torrent of my own justifications, to list my achievements, to prove her wrong, but the words caught in my throat. Her quiet observation, delivered without a shred of malice, had struck a nerve I hadn't even known existed. It wasn't just about my career, it was about my humanity, or the perceived lack thereof. The carefully constructed facade of my competence began to crumble, revealing the insecure core beneath. This wasn't a boardroom negotiation. This was a reckoning, a stark confrontation with the human cost of my relentless pursuit of success. The silence that followed her statement was not a pause in conversation. It was a vast, echoing emptiness, a space where years of unspoken truths began to surface. My father, usually so adept at diffusing tension, sat frozen, his gaze fixed on his plate as if searching for answers in the gravy. My mother's hand, which had been resting on the table, slowly curled into a fist, a silent testament to her own unspoken anxieties. Clara's words had not been an attack. They had been a confession, a desperate plea for me to see myself as she saw me, and perhaps for me to change. The weight of her observation pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating, forcing me to confront the possibility that the very qualities I prided myself on, my drive, my logic, my pragmatism, had blinded me to the most important aspects of life: connection, empathy, and genuine understanding. The meal, meant to be a bridge, had become a fault line, and I was standing on the precipice, the ground shifting beneath my feet. The silence, after Clara's words, was a physical entity, a heavy blanket that smothered any lingering pretense of normalcy. My father's fork clattered onto his plate, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden stillness. My mother's gaze, usually so gentle, held a sharp edge of concern, fixed on me as if expecting me to shatter. Clara, the instigator of this seismic shift, sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't thrown accusations. She had simply stated a truth so potent it seemed to drain the color from the room. I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in what felt like years. The subtle lines etched around her eyes, the slight slump of her shoulders, the way her breath hitched almost imperceptibly. These were not signs of weakness, but of a profound, quiet resilience that I had consistently overlooked. My own carefully curated image of myself as the capable, respected older sibling began to fray at the edges. I, who prided myself on my analytical prowess, my ability to dissect complex problems and devise effective solutions, was utterly disarmed by a single, devastating sentence. "No one takes you seriously." It wasn't a critique of my professional acumen. It was a judgment on my very character, delivered by the person whose opinion, deep down, I valued most. The roast chicken, once a comforting centerpiece, now seemed like a grotesque offering on an altar of my own making. Its rich aroma, usually a source of comfort, suddenly felt cloying, suffocating. My father, sensing the precipice, attempted to break the spell, his voice a strained whisper, "Clara, that's not fair." But his words, meant to defend me, only seemed to underscore the truth of her statement. If my own family felt the need to defend me against such a simple, honest observation, it was a clear indication of how I was perceived. I, the architect of my own success, the master of my own destiny, was apparently a figure of ridicule, a caricature, a person whose pronouncements, however well-intentioned, lacked the fundamental weight of credibility. The realization was a cold, sharp shock, far more potent than any business setback or professional rivalry. It was the dawning awareness that my relentless pursuit of external validation had come at a profound internal cost, a cost that had alienated me from the very people I claimed to care about. Clara didn't respond to my father. She simply looked at me, her expression a complex tapestry of hurt, disappointment, and a sliver of lingering hope. It was in that gaze, in the quiet intensity of her unspoken plea, that the first, almost imperceptible crack appeared in the hardened shell I had built around myself. The ambition that had fueled me for so long suddenly felt hollow, a desperate attempt to fill a void that I hadn't even recognized existed until that moment. The carefully constructed fortress of my ego began to tremble, not from an external assault, but from an internal implosion. This was not about winning an argument. It was about a profound, unsettling recognition of my own profound failure, not as a businessman, but as a human being. The weight of my sister's words settled upon me, a burden heavier than any I had ever carried, forcing me to confront the possibility that my entire life had been a performance, a desperate bid for respect that had ultimately left me empty and alone, even in a room full of loved ones. The silence, once a tense void, now began to fill with the echoes of my own carefully constructed defenses, each one crumbling under the relentless, unadorned truth of Clara's observation. The dinner table, usually a battleground of my own making, had become a silent testament to my failure. Clara's words, "No one takes you seriously," hadn't been a weapon, but a mirror, reflecting back a distorted image of myself that I had long refused to acknowledge. The clinking of cutlery, which had been a constant irritant, now seemed like a distant, irrelevant hum. My father's attempt to placate Clara with a gentle, "Now, Clara, that's not fair," fell flat, his voice lacking its usual conviction. He, too, had seen it, the subtle but undeniable truth in her quiet statement. My mother's hand, which had been nervously smoothing her napkin, stilled. Her eyes, usually so full of warmth, now held a flicker of something akin to pity, a look that was far more devastating than any anger. Clara herself remained still, her gaze fixed on me, not with triumph, but with a profound, almost sorrowful understanding. It was this lack of recrimination, this quiet resignation, that chipped away at my defenses more effectively than any argument. I had always prided myself on my ability to command respect, to project an aura of authority and competence. To have that fundamental assumption challenged, not by a rival or a subordinate, but by my own sister, the one person who had witnessed my entire life, was a blow I hadn't anticipated. The carefully constructed edifice of my professional success, the very foundation of my self-worth, suddenly felt precarious, built on a bedrock of superficiality. I replayed past interactions in my mind, the condescending smiles of colleagues, the polite but dismissive nods of clients, the way my own advice was often met with a subtle, almost imperceptible hesitation. I had always rationalized these instances, attributing them to jealousy, to a lack of vision on their part. But Clara's words provided a unifying, devastatingly simple explanation. I lacked substance. I lacked the inherent gravitas that comes not from authority, but from genuine connection and understanding. The scent of the roast chicken, once a comforting aroma of home and family, now seemed to mock me. Its richness, a stark contrast to the emptiness I felt gnawing at my insides. My usual recourse to launch into a detailed explanation, to list my accomplishments, to assert my authority, felt futile, even pathetic. How could I explain my seriousness to someone who clearly saw a void where it should be? My sister's quiet observation had done what no business challenge or personal setback ever had. It had forced me to confront a fundamental flaw in my being, a flaw that had nothing to do with strategy or execution and everything to do with empathy. The silence stretched, no longer tense, but heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. I saw Clara not as an adversary, but as a witness, a mirror held up to my own distorted reflection. The pride that had always been my shield began to falter, replaced by a gnawing insecurity. This wasn't about winning, it was about a profound, unsettling realization that I had been so focused on projecting an image of success that I had neglected the very essence of what it meant to be a respected human being. The carefully constructed walls of my ego began to crumble, not with a bang, but with a quiet, almost imperceptible sigh, leaving me exposed and vulnerable in the harsh, unforgiving light of my sister's simple, devastating truth. The air in the dining room had thickened, not with the aroma of food, but with an unspoken tension that had finally snapped. Clara's words, "No one takes you seriously," hung in the silence, a stark, unvarnished truth that landed with the force of a physical blow. My father's hesitant attempt to interject, "Clara, that's not quite fair," felt like a weak dam against a rising tide. My mother's steady gaze, usually so comforting, now held a sharp, assessing quality, as if she were seeing me for the first time. Clara herself sat unnervingly still, her hands clasped in her lap, a picture of quiet resignation. There was no malice in her eyes, no hint of triumph, only a profound weariness that spoke volumes more than any accusation. I had always prided myself on my ability to command respect, to project an aura of unwavering competence. My career was built on it, my reputation forged in the fires of relentless ambition. To have that fundamental assumption of my gravitas challenged, not by a competitor or a subordinate, but by my own sister, the repository of my childhood memories and adolescent insecurities, was disorienting. The carefully constructed facade of my authority felt suddenly fragile, like a thin veneer of ice over deep, dark water. I scanned the faces around the table, searching for an ally, a confirmation of my perceived status, my father's discomfort, my mother's troubled expression. They offered no solace, only a confirmation that Clara's observation resonated beyond her own perception. The scent of the roast chicken, once a symbol of familial warmth, now seemed to mock me, its richness a stark contrast to the hollowness that was beginning to bloom in my chest. I felt an urge to defend myself, to list my achievements, to articulate the countless instances where I had demonstrably earned respect, but the words caught in my throat. How could I prove my seriousness to Clara when the very people closest to me seemed to acknowledge its absence? Her quiet statement wasn't an attack, it was a diagnosis, a stark assessment of my fundamental flaw. I had been so focused on climbing, on achieving, on projecting an image of success, that I had neglected the very essence of what it meant to be truly heard, to be genuinely influential. My ambition, once a source of pride, now felt like a desperate, hollow pursuit, a frantic attempt to fill a void that Clara's words had illuminated with brutal clarity. The carefully crafted persona I presented to the world felt like a costume, ill-fitting and transparent. The silence that followed her statement was not a pause, it was a chasm into which my ego tumbled, leaving me exposed and vulnerable. This was not about a business deal, it was about a fundamental failure in human connection, a realization that my relentless pursuit of external validation had rendered me fundamentally lacking in the one currency that truly mattered. Genuine credibility, earned through empathy and understanding. The carefully constructed walls of my self-importance began to crumble, not with a dramatic collapse, but with a quiet, almost mournful settling, revealing the insecure core beneath. The clatter of forks against porcelain had ceased. The air in the room, usually filled with my father's forced pleasantries and my mother's gentle observations, was now thick with an almost palpable silence. Clara's voice, usually so vibrant, had been a mere whisper, yet its impact was seismic. "No one takes you seriously." The words hung between us, a stark, unvarnished truth that resonated with a chilling clarity. I looked at my sister, at the subtle tremor in her lower lip, the way her gaze held a profound sadness rather than anger. It wasn't a taunt. It was a confession, a desperate articulation of a pain I had been too self-absorbed to notice. My father, ever the mediator, cleared his throat, a nervous tick that usually signaled his attempt to diffuse any tension. "Clara, that's not entirely accurate," he began, his voice softer than usual, lacking its typical authoritative tone. But even he, the staunch defender of my achievements, seemed hesitant, his words trailing off into the heavy silence. My mother, usually so adept at projecting an air of calm, shifted in her seat, her gaze flicking between Clara and me, her expression a complex mix of concern and unspoken understanding. I had always prided myself on my ability to command respect, to project an image of unwavering competence. My career was a testament to that. I had climbed the ladder with ruthless efficiency, my focus solely on the next rung, the next victory. In my relentless pursuit of professional validation, I had somehow overlooked the most fundamental form of credibility, the kind that stems from genuine human connection, from empathy, from being truly seen and understood. Clara's observation wasn't about my business acumen, it was about my character, my essence. It was the realization that all my accolades, all my hard-won successes meant little if the person closest to me, the one who had known me longest, felt I lacked fundamental substance. The scent of the roast chicken, usually a comforting anchor, now felt cloying, heavy, a stark reminder of the superficiality of the moment. My usual instinct would be to retort, to list my accomplishments, to forcefully assert my authority. But the words felt hollow, inadequate. How could I explain my seriousness to someone who saw only a void? Clara's quiet statement had bypassed all my defenses, striking at the very core of my self-perception. The carefully constructed edifice of my ego, built on years of external validation, began to tremble. It wasn't a dramatic collapse, but a slow, agonizing erosion, revealing the insecure, unloved core beneath. This wasn't about winning an argument. It was about a profound, unsettling awakening to the human cost of my ambition. The carefully curated image I presented to the world suddenly felt like a cheap imitation, a performance devoid of genuine heart. The silence that followed Clara's words was not an absence of sound, but a presence of truth, a truth that had been waiting patiently for years to be acknowledged. It was the dawning realization that true respect wasn't something you commanded, it was something you earned, through vulnerability, through understanding, through the quiet, consistent act of seeing others as clearly as they saw you. The aroma of the roast chicken, usually a comforting herald of family togetherness, now felt like a suffocating shroud. My sister, Clara, had just delivered a blow that landed not in the boardroom, but somewhere far more intimate, far more devastating. Her voice, barely a whisper, had cut through the polite chatter like a shard of ice. "No one takes you seriously." The words hung in the air, heavy with years of unspoken observations, of subtle dismissals, of a fundamental disconnect I had been too arrogant to acknowledge. My father, ever the peacemaker, attempted a gentle interjection. "Clara, that's not entirely fair." But his voice lacked its usual conviction. He too had seen it, the subtle but undeniable truth in her quiet assessment. My mother, her usual serene expression replaced by a troubled frown, shifted uncomfortably, her gaze darting between Clara and me, a silent acknowledgement of the storm that had just broken. I, who had built my life on the foundation of respect, on the unwavering belief in my own competence and authority, was suddenly adrift. Clara's words weren't about my professional achievements, which were considerable. They were about something far more fundamental: my humanity, my ability to connect, to be truly seen and understood. I had always viewed empathy as a weakness, a distraction from the ruthless pursuit of success. Clara, with her art-filled studio and her paint-stained fingers, was everything I wasn't: sensitive, intuitive, deeply connected to the emotional currents of the world. I had dismissed her aspirations as frivolous, her vulnerability as a liability. And now she, the one person whose opinion I secretly craved, had confirmed my deepest unspoken fear, that my relentless drive had created a void where genuine connection should have been. The carefully constructed edifice of my self-importance began to crumble. My ambition, once a gleaming shield, now felt like a hollow echo, a desperate attempt to fill a space that only genuine understanding could occupy. The silence that followed Clara's statement was not a void, but a presence, the presence of truth, long ignored. My usual arsenal of logical arguments and forceful pronouncements felt utterly useless. How could I argue with a statement that felt so undeniably heartbreakingly true? The carefully curated image I presented to the world, the one of unwavering control and authority, suddenly seemed like a cheap imitation, a performance devoid of authentic substance. This wasn't about winning an argument. It was about a profound, unsettling awakening to the human cost of my relentless pursuit of external validation. The carefully constructed walls of my ego began to break down, not with a dramatic crash, but with a quiet, almost mournful settling, revealing the insecure core that lay beneath. The dinner, meant to be a celebration of some minor professional milestone, had become a stark, unavoidable confrontation with my own profound lack of genuine credibility, not in the eyes of the world, but in the eyes of the one person who mattered most. The clatter of silverware against the polished oak table had ceased, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. My sister Clara sat across from me. Her eyes, usually so full of light, now held a deep, unsettling weariness. The scent of the roast chicken, a familiar comfort, was lost in the thick, suffocating air. My father, ever the buffer, had attempted a light-hearted comment about the football game, but his voice had faltered, the words catching in his throat as Clara spoke. "No one takes you seriously." The sentence, delivered in a voice barely above a whisper, landed with the force of a concussive blast. My initial reaction was a surge of indignant pride. Me not taken seriously. I, who had navigated the treacherous currents of corporate finance, who had closed deals that made fortunes, who commanded respect in boardrooms across the city. It was absurd. Yet as I looked at Clara, at the subtle tremor in her lower lip, the almost imperceptible slump of her shoulders, a cold dread began to seep into my carefully constructed world. My father's attempt at deflection dissolved into a strained cough. My mother, usually so composed, nervously smoothed her napkin, her gaze fixed on Clara with a mixture of concern and apprehension. I had always seen Clara's sensitivity as a weakness, her artistic passions as a naive indulgence. I was the pragmatist, the one who understood the harsh realities of the world, the one who had to be tough to survive. I had offered her advice, often unsolicited and blunt, convinced I was steering her towards a more sensible, more secure path. She, in turn, had always seemed to pity my relentless drive, my perceived inability to appreciate the simple beauty of life. Her words weren't an accusation, they were a statement of fact, delivered with a quiet resignation that was far more damning than any anger. It was the realization that my ambition, my drive, the very qualities I had celebrated as strengths, had also served to blind me, to isolate me, to make me someone who, in the eyes of the person who knew me best, lacked fundamental credibility. The carefully constructed edifice of my self-importance began to tremble. My achievements, my accolades, the respect I had so diligently cultivated in the professional sphere suddenly felt hollow, superficial. How could I be taken seriously if my own sister, the keeper of my childhood memories and adolescent insecurities, saw me as someone lacking substance? The carefully crafted persona I presented to the world felt like a brittle shell on the verge of shattering. This wasn't about a business deal or a hostile takeover. This was about a profound, unsettling awakening to the human cost of my relentless pursuit of external validation. The silence that followed Clara's words was not an absence of sound, but a presence of truth, a truth that had been patiently waiting for years to be acknowledged. It was the dawning realization that true respect wasn't something you commanded through authority or achievement, but something you earned through genuine connection, through empathy, through the quiet, unshakable understanding that you were seen and that you saw others in return. The carefully constructed walls of my ego began to crumble, not with a dramatic crash, but with a quiet, almost mournful settling, revealing the insecure core that lay beneath. The true practice begins now. It lies not in mastering new techniques of persuasion, but in the daily, deliberate cultivation of presence, the willingness to listen not just to words, but to the emotions that underpin them, to offer not just solutions, but solace, to build not just strategies, but relationships. It is in recognizing that the most impactful leadership, the most enduring influence, is not built on the foundation of authority, but on the bedrock of trust, forged in the fires of shared vulnerability and mutual respect. The journey has been one of dismantling the illusion of control to embrace the power of genuine connection, understanding that our greatest strength lies not in our ability to command, but in our capacity to resonate, to be truly seen, and in turn, to see others with clarity and compassion. The path ahead is not about proving oneself, but about becoming oneself, authentically, vulnerably, and with an unwavering commitment to the human heart of every